She worked 14-hour days on that Arkansas ranch, believing her daughter and husband were the only two people in this world she could truly count on. For 70 years, Martha had survived divorce, loss, heartbreak. But nothing could have prepared her for what was coming. You see, while she was out collecting rent from her properties that June morning, the two people she trusted most were planning something unthinkable. Her own daughter, Sarah, had been whispering secrets with her stepfather, Robert, secrets that would shatter a family forever. But here's what makes this story so chilling. It wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated plan that would end in betrayal, violence, and cold-blooded murder. This is the story of how love twisted into hatred, how desperation became deadly, and how a mother's trust became her ultimate downfall. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Martha Williams had always been a fighter. Born in the mountains of Virginia, she knew what hard work meant before she could even spell the words. At 25, she married her first husband, a military man named David, and together they built what seemed like the perfect American family. 4 children, 3 boys, and 1 girl named Sarah. But life has a way of testing even the strongest among us. After 10 years of marriage, cracks began to show. Arguments became louder, silences became longer, and eventually, David took the children and walked away. Sarah was only 12 when her father gained custody, leaving Martha heartbroken and alone. For years, Martha rebuilt her life piece by piece. She remarried in 1961 to a kind man who shared her love for the outdoors. Together, they purchased a massive 750-acre ranch in Washington County, Arkansas. It was their paradise. Rolling hills, fresh air, and the freedom to live life on their own terms. Martha threw herself into ranch work, her hands growing calloused from years of mending fences and caring for livestock. She was tough as leather but had a heart that could melt at the sight of a newborn calf. 20 years into their marriage, tragedy struck again. Her second husband suffered a fatal heart attack, leaving Martha alone with a ranch too big for one person to manage. That's when Robert entered her life. He was 65, a steady man with experience in long-haul trucking who understood the value of hard work. In 1987 they married, and Martha finally felt like she had found her forever partner. But the story takes a darker turn when Sarah, now in her late 30s, came knocking on her mother's door. After decades of separation and silence, Sarah claimed she wanted to reconnect, to make amends for all the lost years. Martha, whose heart had never stopped aching for her only daughter, welcomed Sarah with open arms. She offered her a job on the ranch and even set up a trailer on the property where Sarah could live rent-free. At first, everything seemed perfect. Mother and daughter working side by side under the Arkansas sun, finally healing old wounds. But those who knew them could sense the tension bubbling beneath the surface. Sarah felt overworked and underpaid. She complained constantly that Martha controlled every aspect of her life. Friends would later recall Sarah saying things like, "I hate that woman, and she treats me like a slave." The resentment was growing, day by day, hour by hour. What Martha didn't notice was how close Sarah had become with Robert. It started innocently enough. Shared conversations during Martha's trips to collect rent from their properties. Robert would listen to Sarah's complaints about her mother, offering comfort and understanding. But comfort slowly transformed into something much more dangerous. Late-night conversations became secretive meetings. Supportive words became intimate touches. And before anyone realized what was happening, Sarah and her stepfather had crossed a line that should never be crossed. The affair wasn't just about physical attraction. It was fueled by mutual resentment toward Martha. Sarah resented her mother for abandoning her as a child, even though it wasn't Martha's choice. Robert, meanwhile, had grown tired of Martha's habits. Her occasional gambling trips to nearby casinos, her spending on ranch improvements he didn't approve of. In each other, they found not just physical comfort, but validation for their growing hatred toward the woman who stood between them and what they wanted. Martha remained completely unaware of the betrayal happening right under her nose. She trusted these two people with her life. Literally. When she left for her weekly trips to collect rent, she never worried about leaving them alone together. When she saw them talking quietly, she assumed they were discussing ranch business. When she caught glimpses of their shared glances, she thought it was just family bonding. The very trust that made Martha such a loving mother and wife was setting her up for the ultimate betrayal. As spring turned to summer in 2008, the secret relationship between Sarah and Robert deepened. They weren't just having an affair anymore. They were planning a future together. But there was one major obstacle standing in their way. One person whose very existence prevented them from being together openly and inheriting everything they believed they deserved. That obstacle was Martha herself. And in the twisted logic of desperate people in love, they began to see murder not as a crime, but as the solution to all their problems. If you're following so far, type "I'm still here" in the comments. The summer of 2008 was unusually hot in Arkansas, but the real heat was building inside the Williams family ranch house. Sarah's resentment toward her mother had reached a boiling point, and Robert was feeding those flames with whispered promises of a better life together. During Martha's absence on rent collection trips, they would sit on the porch planning their future, a future that required Martha to disappear forever. Sarah had convinced herself that her mother was the source of all her problems. In her twisted mind, Martha wasn't just controlling, she was evil. Sarah told Robert that Martha had reported her to police for stealing credit card information, though this was never proven true. She painted her mother as a manipulative woman who would never let them be happy together. Robert, who was growing increasingly frustrated with Martha's independence and financial decisions, found it easy to believe these accusations. The conversations between them grew darker each day. Robert would complain about Martha's trips to the casino, claiming she was gambling away their future. Sarah would add fuel to the fire by exaggerating every minor disagreement with her mother into evidence of abuse and control. They created an echo chamber of resentment where every grievance was magnified until murder seemed not just reasonable, but necessary. But they weren't planning to do this alone. Sarah had befriended Maria, a young ranch hand who worked alongside them daily. Maria was hardworking but struggling financially, and Sarah saw an opportunity. She began testing Maria's loyalty, asking hypothetical questions about what someone would do for money. She complained about Martha in Maria's presence, watching to see if Maria would show sympathy or concern. Slowly, carefully, Sarah began to plant the idea that something needed to be done about Martha. The planning process took weeks. They studied Martha's routines, when she left for rent collection, which routes she took where she would be most vulnerable. Robert's trucking background gave him knowledge about remote locations where a crime might never be discovered. Sarah's years on the ranch meant she knew every hidden corner of the property. Together, they developed a plan that seemed foolproof. The scheme was diabolical in its simplicity. Sarah would fake an injury while Martha was out collecting rent from their properties. She would call her mother in distress, begging her to come to a remote part of the ranch immediately. Martha, being the caring mother she had always been, would rush to help without question. Once Martha arrived at the isolated location, they would be waiting. On June 14, 2008, everything was set in motion. Martha left that morning to collect monthly payments from their rental properties, just as she did every month. She kissed Robert goodbye and reminded Sarah to feed the cattle while she was gone. It was a normal morning that would end in unimaginable horror. Around midday, Sarah put the plan into action. She called Martha's cell phone, her voice filled with fake panic and pain. "Mum, I've been hurt," she cried. "I need you to come to the far pasture immediately. I can't move. I think something's broken." Martha didn't hesitate for even a second. She turned her truck around and headed straight for the location Sarah had described. When Martha arrived at the remote spot, she found Sarah lying on the ground near an old fence post. But as Martha rushed to help her daughter, Sarah suddenly stood up, and Martha saw the gun in her hands. The confusion and terror in Martha's eyes in that moment is almost impossible to imagine. The daughter she had welcomed back into her life, the daughter she had forgiven for years of silence, was pointing a weapon directly at her heart. Sarah pulled the trigger, but the gun misfired. Martha, despite being 70 years old, was still strong from decades of ranch work. She fought back with every ounce of strength in her body. The two women struggled in the dirt, mother fighting for her life, daughter fighting to take it. But Martha was outnumbered. Maria emerged from behind a tree, carrying a heavy wooden stick. She struck Martha in the head with brutal force. As Martha lay stunned and bleeding, Sarah picked up a tire iron from Robert's truck. With cold calculation, she beat her own mother unconscious. But they weren't finished. Sarah retrieved a different gun, one that would actually work. Standing over the woman who had given her life, she fired 3 shots into Martha's chest. The sound echoed across the empty pasture, 3 gunshots that would destroy a family forever. What happened next shows just how calculated this murder really was. Instead of calling police or showing any remorse, Sarah and Maria loaded Martha's body into the truck and drove to a predetermined location on the ranch. They poured gasoline over Martha's remains and set them on fire, watching as the evidence of their crime turned to ash and bone fragments. The woman who had spent her life nurturing others was reduced to nothing more than smoke drifting across the Arkansas sky. But the day wasn't over. Following their pre-arranged plan, Sarah and Maria drove to a casino in Oklahoma, establishing an alibi for Martha's disappearance. They spent the evening gambling and laughing, acting as though nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Robert returned from his trucking route just as they had planned. He used ranch equipment to push his wife's burned remains into a deep sinkhole on the property, then fired shots through the kitchen windows to make it look like a robbery. When Robert called 911 to report Martha missing, his performance was Oscar-worthy. He told police about finding the house ransacked, money missing, and his beloved wife gone without a trace. But investigators noticed something odd about Robert's demeanor. He didn't seem upset or worried about his missing wife. Instead, he appeared almost relieved, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. What would you do if you were in Martha's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The investigation into Martha's disappearance would reveal a web of lies, betrayal, and manipulation that shocked even experienced detectives. But justice was coming, and the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it. The investigation into Martha Williams' disappearance began immediately, but nothing about this case made sense to the detectives assigned to it. Here was a 70-year-old woman who had vanished from her own ranch without a trace. Yet her family seemed strangely calm about the whole situation. Detective Stephen Miller of the Washington County Sheriff's Office would later say that Robert's behavior during that first interview was the most suspicious thing he'd encountered in 20 years of police work. Robert's story was full of holes from the very beginning. He claimed to have returned from a long-haul trucking job to find the house burglarized and Martha gone. But investigators found no signs of forced entry, despite bullet holes in the kitchen windows. Martha's cars were still in the driveway, her purse was still in the house, and there was no blood evidence anywhere. If this was a robbery gone wrong, where was the evidence of a struggle? Where was Martha's body? And why would robbers shoot up the kitchen but leave valuable items behind? Sarah's story was equally suspicious. She claimed to have last seen her mother on June 14th while working with Maria on ranch maintenance. According to Sarah, they had worked until late afternoon, then driven to a casino in Oklahoma, and didn't return until the early hours of June 15th. She even provided a toll receipt as proof of their trip. But when investigators checked the timeline, something didn't add up. Martha's cell phone showed activity consistent with receiving a distress call around the time Sarah claimed to be working peacefully on the ranch. For the first few weeks, the case seemed destined to go cold. There was no body, no clear motive, and no physical evidence of a crime. But then investigators began noticing strange behavior that raised even more red flags. Within a month of Martha's disappearance, Sarah had moved out of her trailer and into the main house with Robert. Neighbours began reporting that they'd seen the two of them together in ways that seemed inappropriate for a stepfather and stepdaughter. Local residents started coming forward with disturbing information. Several people reported seeing Sarah and Robert kissing, holding hands, and behaving like a romantic couple rather than family members. One neighbour, Jean Patterson, told police he'd witnessed their relationship growing closer for months before Martha's disappearance. There was something going on between those two that wasn't right, he said. It was more than a normal family relationship, if you know what I mean. This revelation changed everything about the investigation. Suddenly, there was a clear motive for Martha's disappearance. Sarah and Robert weren't just family members who happened to be the last people to see Martha alive. They were lovers who stood to inherit everything if Martha was gone forever. Detective Miller refocused his investigation on the possibility that Martha's disappearance was actually a carefully planned murder, but proving it would be nearly impossible without more evidence. The case went cold for almost 2 years, with investigators unable to make progress despite their suspicions. Then, in April of 2010, a completely unrelated case would crack Martha Williams' murder wide open. Maria, the ranch hand who had provided Sarah's alibi, was arrested for forgery charges in a separate investigation. Facing serious jail time, Maria made a decision that would finally bring justice for Martha. In exchange for immunity on the forgery charges and any information she provided about Martha's disappearance, Maria agreed to tell investigators what really happened on June 14, 2008. What she revealed was more horrific than anyone had imagined. Maria confessed that Sarah had approached her weeks before the murder, asking for help in killing her mother. Sarah had discovered that Martha suspected her of credit card theft and was planning to turn her in to police. In Sarah's twisted mind, this justified murdering the woman who had given her life and welcomed her home. Maria described the elaborate plan they had developed. The fake distress call, the remote location, even the trip to Oklahoma to establish an alibi. But Maria's confession revealed something even more disturbing about the actual murder. She described how Martha had fought for her life with incredible courage, how she had looked at Sarah with confusion and heartbreak as her own daughter pointed a gun at her. She told investigators about Sarah's cold calculation as she beat her mother unconscious with a tire iron, then stood over her and fired 3 shots into her chest. The level of brutality was shocking even to experienced homicide detectives. Armed with Maria's confession, investigators convinced her to wear a wire and record conversations with Sarah. The recordings they obtained were devastating. Sarah not only admitted to the murder, but revealed that Robert had known about their plans from the beginning. According to Sarah, Robert had grown tired of Martha's spending habits and gambling, fearing she would deplete their assets. He saw the murder as a financial necessity rather than a crime of passion. The search for Martha's remains took over 2 weeks and involved dozens of officers combing every inch of the ranch property. Eventually, they located several teeth and tiny bone fragments in a sinkhole that had been filled with ranch equipment. DNA testing confirmed these remains belonged to Martha Williams, finally giving her family the closure they desperately needed. If you're still watching, tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. The trial that followed would expose the full extent of Sarah and Robert's betrayal, shocking a community that thought they knew this family. In August 2010, Sarah Williams faced the consequences of her actions. During her confession to investigators, she revealed the twisted logic that had driven her to murder. She claimed her mother was controlling and abusive, painting herself as the victim even as she admitted to cold-blooded murder. But the evidence told a different story, a story of greed, manipulation, and ultimate betrayal. Sarah accepted a plea agreement and was sentenced to 30 years in prison for taking her mother's life. Robert was arrested for hindering prosecution and covering up the crime. He received 10 years behind bars, but died of cancer in 2014. Never seeing freedom again. Maria, who had cooperated with authorities, received immunity as promised. Martha's family still grieves the loss of a woman who spent her entire life working hard and caring for others. This case reminds us that the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who hurt us deepest. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories every week.